Welcome to Safe on Deck. For episode 4, I sat down with Roy Kinsey at his law office in Pensacola, Florida. Roy is an accomplished aviator and a certified flight instructor who's logged more than 6,900 flight hours. In 2014, Roy founded Veterans Flight, which ultimately became a 501c3 tax-exempt nonprofit corporation dedicated to honoring World War II aviators by putting them back into the cockpit of a World War II-era Stearman, where many of them began their military flight training. Stearman is the most recognized biplane ever built and was the primary trainer for thousands of Navy and Army Air Corps pilots during World War II. By the time the war ended in 1945, more than 8,500 Stearmans had been manufactured at Boeing's Wichita, Kansas factory, along with enough spare parts to build another 2,000 airplanes. After a near 50-year career as a personal injury attorney, Roy is now semi-retired and limits his legal work to representing law enforcement officers involved in use of deadly force incidents. Much of Roy's time is devoted to Veterans Flight and the flights given to World War II veterans every summer during the Pensacola Beach Airshow. When not in his office, Roy regularly flies his 1943 Boeing N2S-4 Navy Stearman and his Mitsubishi MU-2 turboprop twin. Thanks for taking the time to listen. In the future, I plan to continue to share similar interviews with both current and retired military aviators. If you have a question or a suggestion for a future interview, please leave it as a comment below. Safe on Deck, Episode 4 with Roy Kinsey. Enjoy. Where were you born?
I was born in the Brooklyn Navy Yard Hospital on the 15th of May of 1945.
Wow. Okay. What was going on back then?
This country was having some unpleasantness with the Japanese and the Germans, of course.
Yes, sir.
My dad was a Marine officer. He was deployed to the South Pacific. He was one of 3 Marine officers on the USS Randolph, which was one of the large Essex-class aircraft carriers, CV-15, and incidentally was the first of the Essex-class carriers that was hit by a kamikaze.
Wow. What was his job specifically on the ship?
Well, the Marine detachment's job was to protect the ship, keep sailors headed in the right direction, and they were assigned to the gunnery division.
Okay.
And the Marines' Quad 40s, the 40-millimeter anti-aircraft guns, shot down the first Japanese plane that the Randolph shot down.
Wow, that's incredible. Obviously,
well, Marines are supposed to be good shots.
Indeed they are. That's what they're known for. Did he have any I know a lot of times veterans from that time didn't always share quite so much. Did he ever have any stories or anything that he shared, obviously, in subsequent years after that?
He did have stories that he shared. Most of them were humorous stories.
Okay.
Involving certain things like they were in the Panama Canal Zone and going back to the ship and weren't really happy with the way the bus driver was getting the Marines back to the ship, so they threw him off the bus.
Okay.
And drove back and then abandoned the bus, that sort of thing.
That sounds like a very Marine story. I like it.
Yeah, Marines are, I kid about the fact that the Marines are probably the most successful street gang that the world has ever known.
I would agree with that, yes.
And as I was growing up in the southwestern part of Virginia, a little town called Salem, we had many Marine visitors. My dad stayed in the reserves, eventually retired as a Marine bird colonel with about almost 35 years of service.
Wow.
And we had lots of Marines who would come to the house various times. We had some folks who had been on the ship with Dad during World War II on Randolph who would come. One gentleman who'd been a Navy officer, his name is Danny Howe. He was the publicist for the New York football Giants. And incidentally, Wellington Mara, who is part of the Mara family for the New York Giants, was also a naval officer on the Randolph. But Danny would come to every Christmas, and he was the consummate New Yorker, old Irish guy. And you could tell that the people who came, and some of them were Korea War vintage, the people who came, the former Marines, as well as the Navy officers, had been through circumstances that really brought them closer together and made them value the friendships much more than someone you might me playing golf or tennis at a country club.
Yes, sir. Absolutely. That's really incredible that they still had that connection all those years later and still spent time together.
Well, you also realize that sometimes little events that don't seem important at the time make a huge difference in your life. For example, when the Randolph was hit by the kamikaze, they were anchored at Ulithi. And if you ever look at photographs of the anchorage at Ulithi, it's difficult to comprehend that many ships and that much armament and firepower being together in one place. The aircraft carriers lined up were labeled Murderer's Row in the photographs because there was just so much firepower there. Well, the Randolph was anchored there. A Japanese Francis, which was a twin-engine bomber, was coming in. It was misidentified initially as an American aircraft. I mean, it was just a lone airplane coming to a very armored and fortified group of vessels. I mean, literally thousands of vessels. By the time it was correctly identified, it was inside the Combat Air Patrol. It was too late to stop it, and they sounded general quarters. That night, the Randolph was playing a movie on the hangar deck. I mean, this was thought of as being a relatively secure area. For some reason, my dad, I don't know if he'd seen the movie, wasn't interested in the movie, so he had not gone to the movie. He was in the wardroom having a cup of coffee, talking with some of the other officers. General quarters sounded, and he is running to get to his battle station, which is one of the quad 40 mounts on what he called the fantail of the ship, or the stern of the ship. As he's running to get there, that's where the Francis hit. If I remember correctly, pull a book if need be, the Randolph lost 37 guys that night. If my dad had gone to the movie, he would have had time to make it from the movie to his battle station before the Francis hit. Getting from the wardroom to the fantail took longer. He did not get there in time to be killed. Wow. I mean, that's something that training has nothing to do with. Your faith has nothing to do with, though somebody might argue with me on that.
Yes, sir.
It's an old aviation book. You've probably read Fate is the Hunter, written by Ernie Gann.
Of course.
Why does some bad things happen to some people? Other people in very similar circumstances survive, not injured, life goes on. But that was just one of those things. Dad didn't talk about that one much. I only remember him talking about it one time because he was describing some fairly horrible things that the crew had to deal with.
Of course.
Amazingly enough, after initially being assessed as you're going to need to take the ship back to the States to be refitted, a repair vessel, and I've got a photograph of it docked next to the Randolph, had them back in the fight in, I think, just a little bit over 2 weeks. And there is a huge hole in the flight deck going down into the hangar deck. I mean, the things that generation and those servicemen accomplished back in 1945 are just unbelievable.
Absolutely.
And they're the reason that we're living in this great country today that unfortunately some of us don't seem to appreciate.
I could not agree more. Might be a silly question. The Randolph, do you remember what kind of aircraft were on the ship? I'll be honest to admit that I don't know anything about World War II aircraft carriers of the day. Do you know what the different platforms that were on the ship?
You had the F-6F,
okay,
Hellcat.
Hellcat, okay.
You had the TBF or TBM, depending on who manufactured, torpedo bomber.
Okay.
And you also had I believe the SB-2C dive bomber, the Curtiss Helldiver.
Wow.
Other than that, I'm not sure there's any other type of
Sure.
aircraft on there.
Sure.
Interestingly enough, this is a funny story. The Randolph originally, I believe, had Air Group 12 on board, and then in mid-1945, Air Group 16, which is one of the more renowned fighting units in naval aviation during World War II, came on board. And one of the TBF pilots is a gentleman named Harry Minerick. Harry had grown up in Sanford, Florida, had actually gone in the Navy after graduating from Stetson University, wanted to go in, be able to afford to go to med school. Well, he ended up going to flight school with the Navy, became a TBF pilot, and when Air Group 16 joined the Randolph, he was part of the squadron. Harry later received the Navy Cross for sinking a Japanese aircraft carrier. After the war, he went to medical school. My father, after the war, went back to the University of Virginia, where he finished his architectural degree, and my dad accepted a job with an architectural firm in Roanoke, Virginia. And we moved to the small town of Salem, which is just west of Roanoke. At some point, I think I was probably about 5 years old at the time, new doctor came to town. My mother took my brother and I to get established with the new doctor. And my dad, who as a Marine officer liked to make sure everything was happening properly, stopped by and he walked in, looked at the doctor looked at him, and Dad said, "Harry?" And Dr. Harry Minerick said, "Roy?" And the two who had known each other on the USS Randolph became reacquainted, and that was a lifelong friendship.
I'm sure. Yeah.
Lasted until my dad died in 2010.
Wow. What a small world it is.
At times it can be.
Yes, sir. Well, that's really incredible. I want to make sure I talk about you, though. So we talked about New York. Obviously, aviation is a huge part of your life now. Do you remember the first time as a young person you were exposed to it? Was it those stories from your dad, or was it something else?
Well, depends on what you mean by exposed.
Okay.
Obviously, I see airplanes flying at some point in time.
Yes, sir.
But my dad had used the GI Bill after the Second World War to finish his college education at the University of Virginia. He stayed in the reserves. His reserve unit was called active duty for Korea. After Korea, he used his GI Bill to get his private pilot's license. You can't do that today. I think today you've got to get your private on your own, get the GI Bill will pay for the commercial ticket, but you're on your own for the private. So he ended up getting his private pilot's license at Hillman Flying Service in Roanoke, Virginia. His first passenger, after getting his pilot certificate that said the Federal Administration finds you sufficiently qualified to take someone who's dumb enough to go with you in an airplane. Well, I was his first passenger in a 65 horsepower Aranca Champion.
Oh, heck yeah.
A very basic tail wheel, fabric covered airplane.
Absolutely. It's a great machine.
And I think that is where I started to develop my love of aviation.
Do you remember how old you were on that first flight?
I think it was 5 or 6, somewhere in that neighborhood.
Do you remember it at all?
Vaguely, but not much.
Okay, just enough to know you enjoyed it.
I think my mother was not as happy as she might have been about that.
Yes, I certainly understand what you mean there. Awesome. But you got the bug. It's something that you always remembered.
I seriously had the bug.
Cool. So when did you get your first training as an aviator yourself?
I got my first training as an aviator in 1965.
Okay.
I had bounced around a couple of colleges and ended up at Stetson University in DeLand, Florida. DeLand had an airport that had been DeLand Naval Air Station during World War II. And one of my fraternity brothers had a pilot's license. His father was in the legal pharmaceutical business down in the Caribbean, and
that being differentiated from the illegal.
Right. No,
there's two.
No marijuana, cocaine, or
Sure.
anything like that was being handled. Just legal pharmaceuticals in the Bahamas and further south.
Okay.
And Ed had started college at University of Miami, had been injured. He was a football player, been injured, and transferred to Stetson. And he offered to teach me to fly. Now, he was not a certified flight instructor or certificated flight instructor, to use the proper term. But he taught me to fly in a J3 Cub. Now, at the time, I was a little bit larger than I am now. Ed was considerably larger than I was. I remember the two of us in that J3 Cub one day taking 30 minutes to get to 3,000 feet.
Okay.
Let's put it this way. Fortunately, there was no one around who did a weight and balance on us. Airplane flew fine, just didn't have a lot of excess horsepower to get to altitude. And then at some point, Ed said, Roy, I want you to fly with a particular instructor. He signed me off. The instructor said, okay, you're signed off for solo, and it went from there.
Okay.
Now, I did not get my private pilot's license at that point, but because I just didn't have either the time or, more importantly, the money to finish. Though at that point, J3s were renting for $3.95 an hour, and that included the fuel.
Oh my gosh.
Okay.
That's I think the best deal I will have ever gotten when I worked at an FBO for a 152, I believe it was 37 an hour wet, and I thought that was a good deal.
Yep.
Oh my gosh.
Well, I ended up starting law school at Florida State in 1969. And it'd been a while since I'd flown, but I still had the bug, and I was kind of looking for things and how can I do this? And I'm sitting in my apartment in what we called the student ghetto area. And there's a knock on the door. And I open the door, and this guy's standing there, about my age or a little bit younger, had no clue who he was, and he said, I'm trying to find so-and-so. I forget the name. And I said, well, I don't know so-and-so, whoever it is. And there are probably 10,000 students living within a 5-block area here. So I really can't help you, sorry. And he saw a book that I had up on a bookcase. And he said, are you a pilot? And I said, no, I'm not. I've soloed, but that's as far as I've gotten. He said, well, before I came up to Florida State, I was a flight instructor at Burnside Ott in Miami while I was going to Miami-Dade. And we became friends, and we went out and flew a Cessna 150, the predecessor of the 152 a little bit. And I paid for the airplane. He didn't charge me to instruct, but it still became quickly obvious that this was not going to work dollar-wise. I just wasn't going to be able to afford it. Well, I came up with a plan, and I'd been looking at things, researching airplanes, and had decided that the best airplane I could buy at that point in time was a Cessna 140, which was the predecessor of the 150. It's an 85 horsepower tailwheel airplane, very basic. And I just happened at some point to see one advertised in the Atlanta Journal. And I called the number. Lady answered the phone, and I explained who I was and why I was calling. She said, well, I'm sorry, my husband's not here right now. I said, can you tell me a little bit about the airplane? And she said, sure. I said, my husband is a mechanic for Eastern Airlines, and he has rebuilt this airplane. He said, matter of fact, the other day we were, I think she said LaGrange, Georgia, and some guys were there in a Learjet, and they talked about how it looked like a brand new airplane, the 140. And she said, I'll have my husband call you. Well, I ended up connecting with the guy. We talked a little bit. And the price of the airplane was $2,800, which was a huge amount of money for me. But fortunately, I had an automobile. And the automobile was paid for. And it was a 1968 327 Corvette. My father had rewarded me, that's the point, against his better judgment.
With an awesome car.
Yeah. And I was able to convince a banker at Capital Bank in Tallahassee to loan me $2,800 on a 90-day note, which would be renewable, paid with interest. Well, the next thing you know, my buddy who had shown up my doorstep from Burnside Odd, his name's Tom Sheehan, ultimately retired from U.S. Air as a 767 captain. Great guy, terrific pilot, lives in St. Augustine now. We're on an airplane going to Atlanta. And we land. The gentleman who had restored it, who worked for Eastern, picked us up. He was driving a 1963 Chevrolet that looked like it just came off the showroom floor. Pull up at his house. It's immaculate. The airplane was on the strip behind the house. We looked at the airplane, looked really good. He and Tom got in the airplane, flew around a little bit, came back. Tom said, seems to fly fine. Now, at this point, we are doing everything wrong. We are not getting a pre-purchase inspection. We don't really know much about it. Tom knew it flew okay.
Had he flown a 140 before that?
No.
And I'm guessing you had not either.
No, I think he may have.
Oh, he had. Okay.
He'd flown tailwheel airplanes.
Okay.
I'm not sure he'd flown a 140.
Okay.
I had not.
Okay.
I'm looking at this one, so it looks like a good airplane to me.
A lot of trust going on.
Well, a lot of stupidity, which turned out to be made okay because of the integrity of the gentleman who restored it. And I told him, I said, Mr. Scoggins, I brought a check for $2,800. Didn't try to bargain with him or anything else. Just, here's the check, cashier's check. And he said, well, I'm glad you did. He said, because I had a call. Guy came over and looked at the airplane, and he said, I want to buy it. I'm ready. I have the money. And he said, and I told him, I said, I promised this young guy from Tallahassee, Florida State, that if he came up here and looked at it and wanted it, he could have the airplane. So until he comes up here, says yes or no, I can't sell it to you. We only asked one thing of Mr. Scoggins, and that was, would he please fly it from his strip over to a nearby airport, which he did. And then the next day, Tom Sheehan and I flew it back to Tallahassee.
Wow.
And I think I flew it over 350 hours the first year I owned it, used it to get my private pilot's license, my commercial pilot license, and my initial certificated flight instructor certificate.
A great purchase.
And Tom could use it whenever he wanted to visit his girlfriend in Jacksonville.
Wow. So it worked out perfectly.
It did. And actually, when I later sold the airplane, I sold it for $3,000. Actually, $200 more than I'd paid for it, and bought a Cessna 170, which was a slightly larger version of that, or the predecessor of the Cessna 172.
That's really great.
Yeah.
Wow, what a story. That's so cool. What airport did you keep the airplane at?
When I had the Cessna 140, I kept it at Seminole Flying Service at Tallahassee Regional Airport.
Okay.
Or Municipal Airport.
Okay. Hangar, out on the ramp, just wherever you could keep it, I'm guessing?
Most of the time it was out on the ramp.
Okay. Gotcha. Very, very cool. Man, the first airplane, so it begins.
I actually bought that airplane back.
And I was going to get to that, yeah.
Later.
And that's why I was going to ask, why did you sell it? Was it just trying to look up the bigger airplane, the 170, that step up?
A bigger airplane, a little bit fast. Well, I'm not even sure the 170 was that much faster, if at all, but it was larger. The The 140 is a relatively small airplane. You and I would be tight in the front together.
Oh, yeah.
But the 170 that I bought, while the 170 is a great airplane, was not as good a 170 as the 140 was a good 140.
Sure. Just all the little stuff does end up making a difference, and yeah, it's a conglomeration of a lot of little things would be my guess. That's what I've learned with an airplane. It's never 100% perfect, but man, if you start with a nice example, it makes it so much easier to maintain and take good care of.
And the 170 was the airplane in which I had a total of engine failure on my way to take the Florida bar examination.
I'm glad you mentioned that. Would you mind telling that story?
Well, I took the Florida bar exam in July of 1968. So it was, no, I'm sorry. It was July of 1972.
Okay.
Because I was admitted in October of 1972, and I will have been a member of the Florida Bar for 50 years this year in October. But I had flown the airplane from Tallahassee to West Palm Beach, spent the night there with one of my old roommates from law school, and the next day was going to fly from West Palm Beach to Fort Lauderdale International, and then take the bar exam at the Diplomat Hotel in Fort Lauderdale. And I remember at one point thinking, yeah, it'd be fun to just fly down the beach and look at the beach on the way. But on the other hand, a nice straight shot is just right down your paralleling eye. I think it's 95. And you're over a lot of, or near a lot of airports as you go down, because that part of Florida is, I won't say littered, but has lots of airports, many of which were left over from World War II that became municipal or community airports. Well, that's something that's a wonderful advantage that Florida has, is the large number of airports. So I take off, climbed up to 3,000 feet, cruising along. Everything's going great, beautiful day. And I actually had called the tower at Fort Lauderdale. Let them know I was a little bit north and was going to bring my old slow airplane in with all their fast airplanes. And suddenly there's just a slight vibration, and then some blue smoke started coming up from the cowling. The oil pressure gauge went down towards very low. The oil temperature gauge started coming up very rapidly, and obviously had a major problem. And at that point you say, all right, where am I going to go? It's an easy choice. Immediately off to my left was the Pompano Beach Airport. Made a left turn, headed that way. I think I let the controllers at Palm Beach know I was leaving their frequency, was not going to be joining them that afternoon, and called the tower at Pompano Beach. The 170 glides wonderfully. I had no problem getting to the airport. Didn't try to do anything with the power, actually kind of reduced the throttle, hopefully to preserve the engine in case I needed some power. Made the airport very easily, landed, rolled out, felt kind of bad because they had a fire truck out there and a guy in an asbestos suit, which was, in July, that's not a fun thing to be inside of unless something is really seriously on fire near you.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Landed, rolled off the runway. And I think the FBO came out, gave me a hand getting it into their area, parked it. Of course, couldn't do much other than just say, you got to park it. Was able to rent a car, fortunately, and drive down to Fort Lauderdale, and then took the exam the next couple of days. Got a ride back to Tallahassee with someone from Florida State who had come down to take the exam, and soon got started on the odyssey of getting back down, getting the engine off the airplane, getting the engine back to Tallahassee, and getting it redone.
And I know you've told me before, what was the actual cause? What ended up failing inside the engine?
It was a rod bearing,
okay.
Connecting rod bearing. Apparently it had gotten starved for oil.
Okay. Wow.
Not the kind of thing you could find on an inspection.
Exactly. Yep.
Probably indicative of the fact that somewhere along the line it had been neglected a little bit.
Absolutely. Yep. That's where I was about to say, about to head next is, taking care of an airplane. It's not necessarily for you. It might be for the next person that flies it. So that was a little bit of a process. I remember you mentioned, getting parts back and forth and getting it was a new engine installed essentially, correct?
Well, it was the old engine rebuilt.
Rebuilt. That's right.
One of my friends there was an A&P mechanic at the flying service, and we ended up redoing that. But they let me borrow, in a way, a 206, which is a large
Cessna 206.
right,
Yep.
with the cargo doors on it and back seats out, and you put lots of stuff in there. They had a propeller that needed to go to the propeller overhaul shop in Tampa, and I volunteered to fly the propeller down there, drop off the propeller as long as it would be okay to take the 206, fly over to Pompano Beach, get the engine off, put it in the 206, which is a wonderful, very capable airplane, and fly it back to Tallahassee, which I did. Then later we had to get a couple of airplanes to take the engine, people, and tools down to put the engine back on the airplane and fly it back.
That's awesome. And then you got your bird back home after that. Yeah.
Yeah, though there's a little adventure with that too. There's always an adventure,
Okay.
especially when things sit.
I was going to say, I don't know that adventure, so I'm curious to hear about it.
Well, I took off from Pompano Beach, and it was late in the day, and I talked to my same old roommate that I'd spent the night with on the way down and said, can I stop there and spend the night? Which I did. So I'm at Palm Beach International Airport, which is, the two runways are 9 right, 9 left. Those are the primary deals. So when I'm leaving the next day, there's a little bit of a crosswind out of the north. Pretty good crosswind. And I soon discover that the left brake on my Cessna brake's not working. Bottom line is, when I tried to taxi onto the runway, the wind would turn me before I could get there. And of course the tower's saying, wait a minute, what is this fool doing here? Finally I radioed and said, listen, I got a problem here. I can't get out onto the runway because of the wind. Would you mind if I take off from the taxiway? Because I'd literally gotten out and shut the engine down, got out, straightened the airplane up physically. And their response was, we don't care what you do as long as you leave.
That's great.
So I took off on the taxiway from Palm Beach International Airport.
Into the wind.
Into the wind, off we go, or I go because I was by myself, and got it back to Tallahassee, where we did an annual inspection and got everything straight, including the malfunctioning brake, which is fairly easy to fix if you got the tools.
Exactly. Well, Roy, you kind of jumped past it. I wanted to kind of go back and speak about it. You mentioned, obviously, you're an attorney. What attracted you to the law? I know there's a lot of folks that have different reasons why they get into it, but I'm curious kind of what your story is. What made you want to be an advocate for other people in that way?
That's a question I don't think I can really answer.
Okay.
It's not something I always wanted to do. At one point, I thought I would probably be an engineer. I clearly did not have the artistic talent or hand-eye coordination that my dad had. My dad is a very talented architect, but also very good in the engineering aspects. But I didn't have that talent. And as I'm going in the engineering curriculum, I realized I just didn't really want to do that. And very frankly, I didn't want to do something like managing 7-Elevens or something like that.
Sure.
And I'm not really sure why I wanted to be a lawyer, but it just seemed like at a certain point in time that maybe this would be a good thing to do.
Okay.
And I took what we used to call the LSAT. Took the LSAT when I was my last year at Stetson University, and fortunately did extremely well on that. Probably the only thing that got me into law school. And ended up going to Florida State. And as a matter of fact, it was kind of a funny thing because I was talking to one of the deans at Stetson, because I've hanging around to land and had been teaching at Florida Military School. And he was asking me, well, what are you going to do? And I said, well, I've applied to law school, but I haven't heard anything. He said, well, let's call him, because this was in September. And he called the admissions office at the Florida State Law School and was talking a little bit, and he said, they're saying they haven't gotten your transcript from Dartmouth, which is where I'd started college. And he put me on with whoever the admissions guy was, and I said, well, I've got a receipt showing they sent it to you 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago. The guy said, oh, well, okay, come on up and start classes. And I said, well, when do classes start? He said, they started 3 days ago.
Wow.
I said, okay, I can't get there today, but I could probably get there tomorrow.
Sure. What a way to start. Gosh. Was it something that you found very intuitive? It came easily to you?
In some ways, it came easily, but on the other hand, looking back on it, I realize what a good job the law school did in setting up the program. I mean, you've been through the Navy flight program, and from what little I know about the Navy flight program, it is wonderfully done and developed out of many years of experience on how to best identify and train young people to be very competent military aviators. Yeah? Well, the Florida State Law School at that time was relatively new. The first class from the law school had graduated in, I think, June of 1969. They were gone when I got there, but it was still new. And there'd been a lot of pressure. The folks from University of Florida did not want Florida State to start a law school. But Florida State had gotten enough graduates, undergraduate graduates, into the legislature that they got it approved. Well, they were smart enough to hire a retired dean from the University of Iowa, whose name was Mason Ladd, to come down and start the law school. And he hired young faculty, as well as a couple of older faculty members who were just really top-notch. It was a relatively small school, about the third in class size as the University of Florida. Very much into the Socratic method of teaching the law. If you've ever seen the old TV show or the movie Paper Chase, and they set it up for the incoming class, which met as one section. You had about 186 people, all but 3 of whom were males, in the same room. Your first class was at 8 o'clock in the morning. They opened the library at 7. You quickly learned that in Tallahassee, Florida, if you weren't there before 7, you weren't going to find a place to park. So you had to be there. You also knew that if you left, you would not find a place to park. So your next class was at 11. So in between the 9 to 11 period, you had a couple of choices. You could leave and not find a place to park when you came back. You could go into the student lounge and waste your time, or you could go to the library and study. And you didn't spend any money in the library, which you did in the student lounge. And then you had a 1:30 class. Then after that, you were done for the day. But you had an area that you could set up and sort of claim as your own in the library. Stay there and study. Go to the gym if you wanted to. Come back to your area. And then typically about 8 o'clock or so, I would leave. A friend of mine was a bartender at one of the local student-oriented places. I'd go there. He'd give me a beer. I'd get a sandwich from the place next door. Then I'd go home, get up the next morning early, and just repeat that. And I had a study partner who had been an Air Force officer. Turned out he was actually the nephew of former governor of Florida, Leroy Collins. Great guy. But Dick and I, other than being in law school together, really had nothing in common other than being heterosexual males.
Okay.
So when we got together to study, we actually studied. And study groups for law students are something that really improves your learning. You're getting different perspectives. One of the first things you need to learn in law is that in the typical exam, if you reach a conclusion for a question, you've probably written yourself out of 50% of the credit for that answer. You have to be able to analyze and identify the issues. It's like very often when you're flying an airplane and something happens, the first thing you need to do is say, let's don't do anything stupid. Let's identify the problem. Then once we have identified the problem, let's deal with it. Now, in the meantime, obviously in the airplane, you need to keep the thing right side up, maintain a certain speed to keep it controllable, even if it means losing altitude, which hopefully it doesn't. But figuring out what the problem is often more difficult than fixing the problem. So study groups in law schools are very much like that.
Makes sense. Yep. That analytical mind is what they're trying to cultivate.
And when you're sitting in a class with 180 of your closest friends and fellow sufferers, you learn to appreciate other points of view, even when they're obviously wrong. And looking back on it, I have very fond memories of Dean Mason Ladd. Mason Ladd, when he was the dean at Florida State, was probably in his 80s, had become a little bit frail, relatively. He was not a physically imposing specimen, relatively small gentleman, used 2 canes, taught evidence from a textbook that he had written. He was so entertaining that we would take dates to his class on Friday.
Oh my gosh.
And I'm talking about not female law students, because there were hardly any of those and most of them were married. These were undergraduate girls.
That was that interesting.
And he was that entertaining.
Wow. Okay.
And you came to realize that, at least in evidence, there is a rationality behind the principles and what they call the rules of evidence.
Very interesting.
So I know we're off topic here about how did I get into this.
I asked, yeah.
But I realized, I guess, that I enjoyed it. Like to think I had somewhat of a talent for it. And looking back on it, I have absolutely no regrets and would not do anything differently. Now, if I had to make that decision in today's world, knowing what I know, it would be a much more difficult decision.
Sure. And I'm guessing things have changed a little bit since then, and that's probably why, just as a...
Things have changed a tremendous amount.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that has not changed, though, I think, is your love for aviation. It's stayed with you ever since then.
Oh, absolutely.
And I want to step through the airplanes. So you mentioned Cessna 140, Cessna 170. What was next? Was it back to the 140?
No.
No.
I went from the 140 to the 170.
Okay.
And my initial thought was to go to the 180. And I actually flew a 180. First time I ever flew a 180. Flew it from Pensacola to Tallahassee to have my friend who had rebuilt the engine in the 170 do a pre-buy on it. We'd learned a little bit here, not a whole lot. And he said, Roy, I don't think this is the airplane for you. And I was smart enough at that point to listen to him. But I ended up buying, not long after that, a 1951 B Bravo 35 Bonanza, the V-tail Bonanza. And it was an interesting airplane. Originally had a 205 horsepower Continental. Later we replaced that with a 225 with a hydraulic Hartzell constant speed propeller. Great airplane. Kept that for a number of years and then ended up buying a J-35 1958 Bonanza, which was a terrific airplane. It was both of them were instrument equipped, but the B model was legal but did not have the redundancy that you'd like to have, also did not have the fuel capacity.
Okay.
The J-35 that I had the 15-gallon tip tanks. I mean, it could stay up a lot longer even then than I could stay up. Today's world, no question, airplane wins.
Sure.
And I flew that for a number of years. Also had another J-35 at the same time for a while. I bought it and then resold it. And then after that, I had an A-36 Bonanza, which was a great airplane, a little bit larger. Probably not any faster than the J model, but it carried more, had the cargo doors. My wife actually took that and with our daughter went to the Bahamas by herself with the two of them. Just the two of them loaded up and went to the Bahamas while I was getting ready for a trial that helped pay for airplanes.
That's incredible. So, and was that the mission for all the airplanes? Was just to travel around the state of Florida, visit family, visit friends?
Well, do traveling and travel for business.
Okay.
Back then, lawyers traveled a lot more than they do now. There was no such thing as the internet. I can remember buying a computer that had a 20 kilobyte, not 20 megabytes or gigabytes, but a 20 kilobyte hard drive. And that was a whiz-bang unit at the time.
I'll bet it was not cheap either.
I don't remember how much it was, but
yeah.
But technology has come an amazing distance since then.
Sure. So you needed to be mobile. You needed to get where you needed to go for your practice.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we also had a Cessna 182 retract at one point. I forget how it was a Pen Air repossession. And my wife actually used that to get her instrument ticket.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay. All out of the Pensacola area, Pensacola International Airport?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll be honest, I don't even know. Do you have a hangar there, multiple hangars there? I mean, it sounds like you've been there a couple of years.
Well, I read a couple of hangars from Pensacola Aviation Center.
Okay, awesome.
From Bill Hudgens, who's a wonderful guy, and they're great folks there and big supporters of veterans flight.
And you've seen the airport change over the years, too.
Yes.
It seems like it's gotten a lot bigger. And again, I've been here all of a couple of years, so I don't have nearly the perspective. Was it just kind of a quieter, sleepier airport, or has it always been a pretty busy place?
It's been a relatively busy place, but airline traffic has picked up tremendously. Of course, things like ST Engineering are new.
Sure.
The corporate side, I'm trying to remember exactly when that happened, because when I initially got my MU-2 in 97, it was on the northwest side of the airport.
Really?
Where the freight operation is.
Okay, yep.
And I actually had a hangar there that I owned, that I kept my Barons, because I'd had a couple of Beech Barons in the meantime. And that hangar went away during Hurricane Ivan. It's never been seen since. Probably somewhere over in Bay Minette or a place like that.
And I'm hoping there was not an airplane inside of it.
There was not an airplane.
Oh, thank God. You flew it out, I'm guessing?
I flew it out.
Yeah. Wow. Well, since you mentioned it, wow, we're all over the place, but what was the Hurricane Ivan like? From the folks that I know that have been here back in the day, said it was a pretty watershed moment. It was a lot of damage to the base, a lot of damage to the local area. A lot of folks left. Is that a pretty accurate statement?
I don't know a lot about a lot of people leaving, but it's a very accurate statement. It was interesting because, I kid about the fact, I'm a lawyer, I'm a father, but I'm not an admiral or general. I cannot give people orders. I can give them suggestions. And I'd suggested to my wife and daughter that with Hurricane Ivan, they get in the airplane and go. And my wife had actually evacuated with us during one of the earlier hurricanes when we went to Memphis in one of the Barons. And she said, no, I'm just going to go over to Jenny's house, our daughter. She lives on Blunt Street, well off the water, and we'll spend the night there and take the animals over there, whatever. I said, okay, well, I'm going to take the dog, different dog than we have here. I'm going to take the dog and go up and see my dad in southwestern Virginia. My mother had passed away by that time. I was the last airplane to leave Pensacola. As a matter of fact, one of the airport police officers had to physically open the gate to let me get in because they'd shut off the electricity, got in, got the airplane ready, the tower had closed down, and I took off and went up to Roanoke, Virginia. And I was asleep in the guest bedroom in my dad's house, and the phone rang about 2 o'clock in the morning. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, it's generally not good news. And my dad, largely because I think of the artillery, anti-aircraft artillery during the war, did not have the best of hearing in his later years, though I've been accused of the same thing. And I answered the phone, and it was my daughter. And she said, "Father, I am really scared." And I turned on the television, which I think back then was non-high definition, may even still been black and white. And I'm looking at it, and it's showing that the eye wall is just coming ashore, a little bit west of Pensacola, which puts Pensacola in the worst quadrant. And my daughter is telling me that she and her mom are at her house, and they are in a closet under the stairway. And they are in that closet because we talked about things, and the stairway gives you extra structure. And there are a couple of inches of water in the closet. And obviously at this point, there's not anything I can do than maybe being falsely reassuring. And I said, well, I'm watching things now that the hurricane's coming ashore. Things should be getting better soon. So I think you're going to be okay. Now, I had no real basis to say that other than let's try to make them feel a little bit better.
Absolutely, yeah.
My wife had been on her cell phone, and she was talking to the folks at the Pensacola Police Department because she wanted to let them know where they were. Not to come get them, but just here's where we are. Tomorrow, if the whole house is down on it, take a look, see if we're alive in here.
Yeah.
Which I didn't know was going on. So after that, phone call's over. Hopefully everything's going to be okay, but nothing you can do about it. Well, it turned out that shortly after that phone call, they're in the house still under the stairway, and they hear this bang, bang, bang. And my wife said, that sounded like a Kel light hitting the front door. Bang, bang, bang. So they come out of the closet, go to the front door, and there's a sergeant and a lieutenant from the police department.
Wow, that was a quick response.
And they said, Judge, let's go. So my wife is, she's now the senior county judge for Escambia County. So they can't get the patrol car to where they are. They have to go a little ways because of trees that are down. They get in the patrol car. Then they're driving through people's yards to get finally to the police station, which they do.
And this is as the storm is still passing through Pensacola.
Yeah, the storm's passing through. And
yeah. Not great weather is what I'm getting. Yeah. Oh, my gosh.
And apparently the chief was not real pleased that they'd gone out and done this. But they just picked up on it and said, well, we'll take care of this.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, and of course, after that, the airport at Pensacola was closed for about 7 days, partially because of debris that had to be cleared, and also because they were flying in rescue supplies and things like that. Well, I ended up spending about 3 days with my dad, bought a fairly large Honda generator that we were able to get in the airplane, and then the dog and I flew down to Savannah to visit another old friend of mine. And we had to be careful what we said because we're sitting down there in Savannah, and our big problem is it was too rough to go tarpon fishing.
Probably don't want to relay that bit.
No, we did not. We did not mention that.
I think that was a smart move.
And I'm getting regular reports, and my wife, in the meantime, had acquired a generator, and so they were keeping the refrigerator going, but there was no air conditioning, anything like that. And I'm not talking about what we're doing in the Savannah area. We just said we're okay here, but we're anxious to get home. And
which was true.
Finally, I do get home. After about 7 days later, get to the house with the Honda generator, which I had in the back of my truck. And about an hour after I get home, the power's restored.
Perfect timing.
So the generator was never put to use.
Okay.
But I had predicted that it would take 7 years for Pensacola to recover from Hurricane Ivan. And even after 7 years, there were still some blue roofs.
Wow.
Now, while we had a large number of trees come down at our house, other than one window that had been hit by a limb, we really didn't have any damage. And we're on Bayou Tahar. My wife and daughter walked over to the house the morning after the storm, and my wife described it as being almost disorienting because the water was up almost to our deck, and we're at about 14 feet above sea level. One of our neighbor's boats was about 10 feet up, wedged in two of our palm trees.
Wow. Yeah. Power of Mother Nature.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that was the only damage, was that window? Or was there more to it than that?
No, that was about it.
That was it. Wow.
But the trees that came down, I think you could have gotten some lumberjack experts from Oregon or someplace like that, and they could not have felled the trees better than circumstances caused them to come down.
That's incredible.
They did not hit the house.
Yeah.
I mean, it was amazing.
That is amazing. What's that decision like? And I've been fortunate. The time that I've been in Pensacola, I've never had. We came once. We thought we were going to fly the helicopters out for a hurricane back in 2015 or 2016, and go pack a bag. And then the next morning, the weather improved. I think the storm went east to Tallahassee. What's that decision like when you have your own airplane, you have your family, you have your home, you have your pets, so many things to think about? Because something that people have told me about is a lot of times there's a little bit of I don't know what the right term for it is, but this is just, it's another storm. People just grow tired of it. But at a certain point, that was the storm to leave for, clearly. How do people kind of stay in the right mindset when that's a part of your life all the time down here on the Gulf Coast?
I think it's probably based on experience and the fact that most of the time it's not going to be that bad. I used to kid about the fact that if Jim Cantori shows up, don't worry. Mike Abrams, you're screwed. I think it's Abrams. But the really destructive parts of most hurricanes are relatively small. Now, I guess it was last year before Hurricane Sally, I had made a decision, and we have far less trees than we did for Ivan. I made a decision to have 5 trees taken out for Hurricane Sally, and it turned out to be a very fortuitous, smart decision. Though Sally fooled a lot of people. I mean, it turned out to be a lot worse and a lot more enduring than most. It sort of sat here, and for a day or so, it's like you had a fire hose on the east side of your house.
Really? Yeah. It was just a rain event, just nonstop rain. That's the way everyone's described it.
And a lot of wind.
A
lot of wind and rain. I mean, It was over 95 knots at NAS in the middle of the night. Because I was looking at when you're an airplane nut, you're also a weather nut. You're kind of watching stuff.
Yeah.
But
goes with the territory.
And of course, you're going to lose some sections of your dock and things like that. But for the most part, generally, you realize you're not going to get hit that badly, and you've made preparations for it. Like now, I have a metal roof on my house, which It's far more secure than the asphalt shingles.
Of course.
The hangars that we have and where I keep the airplanes at Pensacola are much better than the hangars, especially the one that departed for parts unknown.
For Bay Minette, yeah.
Yeah. Though in many ways, especially with the MU-2, airplanes are faster than hurricanes. You can go somewhere else.
Yeah.
But you also need to give a little bit of thought to where you're going, because at some point the hurricane may catch up with you, and you better be prepared to move again if need be, because you may not have a hangar space where you are.
Yeah. Yeah, lots to consider. This will be my first full season as a airplane owner down here, and this is a very first world problem for sure. I will also, I'm sure, be asked to, probably fly an airplane out for the Navy. So I've already told my brother, hey man, when the Stearmans are coming, the plane's going back to live with you in Tennessee.
Yep.
Because I'll be flying a Navy airplane out, and my poor wife will be by herself here figuring out what she's going to do after that. So just kind of learning the process as one of the new people with none of that experience. So that's why I wanted to ask. But I guess we're all still talking about aviation. Obviously, I know what you've used the airplanes for, but one thing I love, and I'm looking at the pictures behind you, which no one but I can see, is a lot of tailwheel airplanes. And I know these days, for whatever reason, a lot of people, obviously Mustang, Corsair, Stearman, there's a lot of airplanes that hold a special place in people's heart. But was that something you ever, I'll be honest, when we bought the RV6, our little airplane, I very consciously wanted an RV6, not a 6A. I wanted that tailwheel. I think it looks great. Frankly, it's made me a better aviator, very conscious of where the winds are and crosswind inputs and all that stuff. Was that ever anything for you that kind of drove your, obviously, and I guess I should have mentioned you have a Stearman, but, kind of like you mentioned, the 140, the 170, a lot of tailwheel airplanes in your past. Is that just kind of a happenstance, or is that something you ever purposely sought after?
It's probably a combination of the two.
Okay.
One factor is the typical tailwheel airplane, especially when I was acquiring them, was older. Therefore, it is less expensive. In addition to that, they're simpler. If you look at a Cessna 140 and compare it with a 150, the 150 has a nose wheel structure that is a hydraulic shock absorber, and it requires more maintenance than the tail wheel does. Also, it has more drag than the tail wheel does. The tail wheel is lighter, it's more aerodynamically efficient, and it's much easier to maintain. Now, the downside of that is flying tailwheel airplanes is more challenging than flying most nose wheel airplanes, simply because tailwheel airplanes were designed initially because airports were grass or dirt. For example, the Stearman is a very different airplane on grass than it is on asphalt. Grass is much more forgiving because your wheels will slide. But when you've got the center of gravity that is both behind the main wheels and in the Stearman especially high, because the fuel is in the center section of the upper wing, you've got to make sure it is lined up with the runway when you touch down, not going sideways.
Yep, absolutely. I think it keeps you honest. It makes you, at least for me, it makes me a better aviator, because you can't, one thing in the helicopter, okay, you have a 30-degree crosswind. Turn the helicopter 30 degrees, land straight into the wind, no
Yep.
problem. Not so in a tailwheel airplane. You have to really be on it, and you have to be very conscious of what the airplane's limits are, and then honestly what your personal limits are. If I haven't gone out recently and flown in a crosswind, okay, I need to go do that to make sure I still feel proficient. I still feel that I can do it safely. So I found, I don't know if you feel the same way, but I found it keeps me honest. It's made me a better aviator.
Well, very frankly, and especially when you get to be my age, there are days when you say, we could go fly, I can probably handle this, but it's not going to be comfortable. You're
Yep.
going to get bounced around. It's not going to be fun. And if you should mess something up, people are going to say you were an idiot, and you'd have to agree with them.
Absolutely. Yep. Risk versus reward. Is it worth it today?
Yeah.
I agree.
And especially with airplanes like the Stearman. Even though Stearman owners like Phil Webb and I are registered owners in the eyes of the Federal Aviation Administration, we are literally custodians of pieces of history. I frequently say Stearmans are a symbol of a time when things were different in America.
Absolutely. It's really cool to still see that symbol flying and to remember. I don't know what it was like, but it gives me memories of what I've been told and what I've heard. So,
well, one of the things that we've enjoyed a lot with Veterans Flight is having young ensigns and second lieutenants who are in the pre-flight program. They haven't actually started flying yet. I think it was API.
Yes, sir. API. It's knife now, but yeah, same thing.
But they come out and they help us load the veterans in the airplanes. From my perspective, one of the most important things they do is they keep family members who maybe aren't familiar with airplanes, but who are focused on the veteran, they want to get photographs, keep those people safe and away from propellers. You know, someone who isn't around airplanes or doesn't really know airplanes often doesn't realize that when a pilot is sitting in a Stearman, he cannot see on the ground what is directly in front of him. All he's seeing is the back of an engine and parts of the fuselage. So we use the ensigns and the second lieutenants, and actually this past year we didn't have them because of COVID, but we had some volunteers from the museum, young enlisted kids who came out, who were absolutely wonderful. And let's put it this way, in some ways, maybe even a little bit preferable to the ensigns because they weren't as interested in phones. They put their phones away and everything was good.
That's awesome.
But they keep the people separated. But the veterans really enjoy talking with them. And when you're talking, or when they're talking with someone who went through a similar program in the early 1940s, and then maybe like Dick Pace ended up flying F-6Fs off an aircraft carrier off the coast of Japanese islands, or flying PBYs at night trying to drop bombs on Japanese freighters, that sort of thing. I mean, these are people who have actually done it.
Yeah.
I mean, we've had veterans come and fly with us who were prisoners of the Japanese, prisoners of the Germans.
Wow, that's incredible. And I apologize so very much, Roy, for not mentioning that yet. So I want to get to it literally next. You are the founder. I guess, I don't know if founder is the right term, but it's
as good as any term.
It's the term that I like.
Chief cat herder, one I use frequently.
Of Veterans Flight here in Pensacola. But that's because you own a Stearman, and you already alluded to that, a beautiful World War II era primary flight trainer. So I wanted to see, before we talk about Veterans Flight, if you could talk me through why you wanted to acquire a Stearman, kind of the journey to get it here to Pensacola, and I think that'll probably roll in really nicely with Veterans Flight and what it is today.
Well, sort of like, why did I go to law school? I'm not sure there's an easy way for me to identify why I bought a Stearman, why I wanted it. But I had been looking for one off and on for a number of years. Actually gone and flown some. Had never really flown one that I said, this is the right airplane. There was one that was very close, except it was an Army Air Corps colors airplane rather than Navy.
Okay.
And living in Pensacola, I wanted a Navy airplane. And I kid about the fact that I did a lot of legal research and determined that there was no state nor federal prohibition against giving yourself a 65th birthday present. So as I was approaching my 65th birthday, I maybe got a little more diligent about looking for an airplane. And I was constantly monitoring the internet forum of the Stearman Restorers Association. And I'm looking at it one day, and a gentleman whose name is Jim Ratliff. He was a retired Delta captain, flown C-130s in the Air Force Vietnam era, and lives a little bit on the southeast side of Atlanta. and it's a residential air park. And he posted that he was helping the widow of the gentleman who owned the hangar next to his sell his Navy Stearman. So I called Jim and introduced myself to him. We're talking about Stearmans and this airplane, and after about 10 minutes, he said, Roy, he said, this airplane is a solid airplane, but it is not as nice as it sounds like what you want. You need to call Alan Thompson. I said, well, he said, Alan's about to finish an airplane. He's having some health issues, and the airplane's going to be for sale. I said, well, who is Alan Thompson? He said, well, Alan was a retired mechanic for Delta. He was the lead when Delta restored its DC-3, and he's built award-winning Stearmans. Well, it turned out that Alan Thompson is one of the nicest people you're ever going to meet. So the next week, a friend of mine, matter of fact, the guy who took me for my first Stearman flight, a former Marine A4 guy, borrowed a Cessna 182 because we needed an airplane that we could land on some short grass strips, and went and looked at both airplanes. And I told Alan Thompson, I said, Alan, they're going to throw me out of the lawyers' union for this. I'm not going to try to bargain with you. Your price is fair. Just tell me when the airplane will be finished. And I knew the next person that saw that airplane would buy it. I have absolutely no regrets. Well, Alan's strip, which is on a family property that they've owned for several generations, is under the Class B or airspace of Atlanta.
Okay.
Now, you can fly Stearmans there, but if you put an electrical system in it, which they didn't have initially, then suddenly you got to add all kinds of expensive radios and stuff like that. So it was just a great airframe, had a battery to start the engine, had an electric starter, but no radios, no electrical system.
Very, very basic. Yeah.
So I knew that we're going to have to add radios because the folks out here at Pensacola International get upset if you just come in and land and don't talk to them. So the local Stearman guru here is a gentleman named Chip Maples. And Chip has a shop at Grass Strip north of Chumuckla. And I'm talking to Chip about it, and he said, well, who's restoring the airplane? I said, well, a gentleman by the name of Alan Thompson. And he said, oh, my God. He said, Alan and my dad, and his dad was big on the air show circuit, the flying mayor of Milton. He said, my dad and Alan Thompson were friends for years. He said, if Alan is restoring this airplane, I'm really going to have to do some top quality work. So Chip and I go up and look at the airplane again and talk to Alan some more. And on the 24th of May of 2010, my friend Jim Wilson and I, same borrowed 182, we go back up there, pick up the Stearman, fly it back to Pensacola.
Okay.
And then we end up having to design the console for the radios and pick out the equipment and get it all ordered. And in the meantime, the tower is letting me fly around just using a handheld radio. You know, I don't have a transponder or any of the other stuff that makes you show up on radar, so I'm trying not to irritate them any more than absolutely necessary, but people will forgive a lot if you show up in a Stearman.
It's very true. Big shout out to the guys at Pensacola, and guys and girls are wonderful, wonderful people here. The controllers are fantastic.
Absolutely they are. Absolutely.
And they, fast jets, airliners, Stearman, literally anything and everything in between, and they work us all in and do a great job of it at the same time.
We have some of the busiest airspace in the country here.
Yes.
And unlike the Atlantas or O'Hares, where most of it is all fast-moving jets, here you've got very slow airplanes to very fast airplanes, got little airplanes, big airplanes, you name it, and you've got all levels of piloting competence.
Yes, absolutely. From the very, very beginning to the folks that are very, very senior and understand exactly what's going on. Yes.
But we end up bringing the airplane to Pensacola. do some planning, and on a Sunday afternoon, I'd made arrangements, since all the equipment had come in, to fly the airplane up to Chip's place, leave it, and he'd get started on putting the stuff together. And he was giving up part of his Sunday to come in and meet me at 5 o'clock, 1700. And so we're getting the airplane out of the hangar. Got the same borrowed 182 to go up and pick me up at Chip's.
I'm sensing a theme here. Yeah.
And the golf cart from Pensacola Aviation Center pulls up. And young line guy's driving it. There's an older gentleman seated next to him in the front. And then in the back of the golf cart is another guy who's about my age. So old, but not as old as the gentleman in the front.
Of course.
I don't know who they are. Well, it turned out that the older gentleman, his name Norman Cockman, he had been a Navy Stearman and SNJ instructor during World War II. And he and his wife lived close to the airport and had seen me flying over their house. The younger guy was his son-in-law. His name is Jim Pattison, who was a retired Delta guy who had flown F-14s in the Navy. And at that point in time was actually flying an airplane, I think a Saberliner, for Quint Studer.
Okay.
Who's a local, very well-known entrepreneur and philanthropist here in Pensacola, and writes a great column in the Pensacola News Journal about business leadership every Sunday. Great guy. And they had come out to the airport just on the possibility they might see the airplane. So we're talking a little bit, and I said, gentlemen, I apologize for being rude, but I've got to get this airplane up to Chip Maple's place. He's coming in. It's going to be tight as it is now. But tell you what, as soon as we get all the equipment in it, and I get really comfortable with it, and I may have been pushing the envelope a little bit there because there's times when I'm still not always really comfortable, but when I get marginally competent in this thing, we'll take Mr. Cockman for a flight. Well, obviously to do what we did to the airplane to get it ready, and Chip did a masterful job. Took several months, get it done. And around Veterans Day in 2010, we arranged the flight for Mr. Cockman. Well, if there's one thing aviators are good at, that is taking what should be a fairly simple process and getting it embellished and making more to it. So the next thing you know, we not only had Mr. Cockman out there, we had another airplane flown by a Navy P-3 driver, which was a decathlon, an aerobatic airplane to put the son-in-law in. And then we had a Cessna 185 with a skydiving door to put a photographer in. And my wife said, you know, if you fools are going to do all this stuff, we're going to have some other things going on, so we'll have some food and nice stuff. And Channel 3 came out, the News Journal came out. Actually had a lady, and I'd seen her on a news program, who had gone on one of the honor flights, airline flights to D.C. And she had been a parachute rigger during World War II and had actually worked on Stearmans. Not just with parachutes, because they actually had them doing fabric work sometimes. They had enough parachutes packed, you do the fabric. And she came out, offered her a Stearman flight, and she said, no, when I was in the service during the war, the flight instructors would take us up to make us sick, but we got flight pay for doing it. We put up with it. But it just turned out to be a wonderful thing. And that became the genesis of what later became Veterans Flight.
What was it like on that first flight flying with someone that had so much experience in the airplane? I mean, certainly not. I don't want to short sell your amount of time and experience in the airplane, but I'm guessing he had probably a little bit more and a different appreciation for it. What was it like flying with someone who was so experienced and had so much knowledge?
There's a lot of pressure there. The main thing is you don't want to do anything that's obviously stupid.
Of course.
You don't want to hurt anything. At that point in his life, he was at a stage of life where he wasn't going to criticize you. He was just sort of enjoying the moment. And interestingly enough, in many ways, he felt a little bit guilty because he had never gone overseas. One of the things that happened, there's a nice article that's up on the wall over here. At that point, Jeff Miller was our congressman from this area. And his office obviously monitors things. They picked up on this, and I got a call from his local chief here. And she said, the congressman saw the article. He wants a couple of things. Number one, he wants you to have Mr. Cockman, tell him the congressman expects him to be on the next honor flight. Because he had never gone on an honor flight because he just didn't feel like he should because he had not gone overseas.
And I want to make sure I describe that program, the Honor Flight and Veterans Flight, two different things. The Honor Flight flies veterans from wherever they are in the United States up to Washington, D.C. It's a one-day program. I think they come back the same day, right?
I think they may.
Yeah,
yes.
And so they get to see the World War II Memorial.
Iwo Jima Memorial.
It's a wonderful tour of D.C.,
yeah.
But two separate programs. So I just want to make sure I
totally separate.
Absolutely.
And there they are putting them in an airliner, and
yes.
I think typically a guardian goes with them,
yes.
and off they go.
Absolutely.
And it's a great program, wonderful program. Whereas what we do, and we focus more on World War II aviators and aircrew, though we don't disqualify people, but just we're seeking out particularly the pilots, the great bulk of whom got their initial training in these Stearmans. Because during the war, Boeing made over 8,500 of them, and they were used by the Army, used by the Navy, used by the Canadians, though the Canadians quickly figured out that the Canadian weather and Stearmans probably aren't the best mix.
Open cockpit biplane, yeah.
And started doing training here in the United States. And Phil Webb's airplane was one of those. Started
Absolutely.
in Canada, came back.
Yep.
So we're oriented to that. And we do it as part of the Pensacola Beach Blue Angels Airshow. Now, we do other flights during the year, but that's when we bring in, I hate to say a large number because compared to what they had during the war, it was not a large number, but we'll bring in 10, 11, 12 Stearmans.
And from all over the U.S. I mean, they're
from all over the Southeast, because it takes a while to get somewhere in a Stearman.
Fair enough, yes.
But we have one that comes from Memphis. We actually have one that comes from Bloomington, Illinois.
That's a long way to Stearman. Yeah.
And he's a former Marine F4 driver.
Ah, very cool.
Who recently retired from FedEx. Great guy. And the best formation instructor I've ever flown with.
I can believe it. Yeah. And that's usually, I want to say middle of July, after the 4th of July. Usually that's when the event is.
It is after the 4th. This year it's the 8th, the 9th of July, Friday and Saturday.
Okay.
The folks at the beach would prefer it to be a little bit later because they want to have two distinct multi-hotel room bookings.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But it's a great event. And we put these guys back in the cockpit. And keep in mind, they typically vary in physical capabilities from some who've been in their 90s that can get in the airplane easier than I can, to some that are in wheelchairs that we literally have to lift up and put in the cockpit.
Wow.
But even the ones that are, let's say, very physically challenged by the ravages of time, and you can't see it as the pilot because you're behind them. But if you're outside the airplane, you'll watch and they'll be kind of slumped over and some of them almost look dejected. And then the airplane starts. And when the engine starts, there's a transformation. And they're sitting up, they're looking around, and when it starts to move, they've got to look like they're in their 20s again. I mean, it's an amazing thing to see happen.
I'm sure it is. And I know you've had, and it's not just veterans that live in this area. There are folks that have traveled, I don't want to say as far away as Alaska, that have come all the way here to participate in the
This
Veterans Flight.
past year, we had a gentleman. Now, he technically was not a World War II guy. He was just post-World War II.
Okay.
But he was a naval aviator, was a Marine. And he and his son, adult son, traveled from Juneau, Alaska to come fly with us.
So that's your record. That's the farthest away, I'm guessing.
They are the furthest geographically away. Yeah.
Wow.
And we had two guys, one of whom was from Chicago, who was a Army Air Corps B-24 pilot. I think he was 98. And then a gentleman whose name is Art Leach from Pontiac, Michigan, which is right around Bloomington, Illinois, or Pontiac, Illinois, rather. And he was 102, and he flew F-6Fs in the Navy.
That's incredible. How many years since the first Veterans Flight?
Well, the first Veterans Flight with Norman Cockman, single airplane, was in 2010.
Okay.
The first air flights where we had more than one airplane were 2014, and we had 4 Stearmans. All of the guys who flew with us in 2014 have since passed away. Dick Pace being the last one, who died a little bit over a week ago at 102 and a half.
Incredible.
And until recent years, he used to drive himself to the airport in a 600 horsepower Maybach Mercedes SL.
Wow. That's impressive.
Absolutely. And he was also the kind of guy that if you look up gentleman in the dictionary, don't be surprised if there's not a photograph of Dick Pace next to the definition.
And my guess is he's probably typical of the folks of that generation that just did wonderful, incredible things, like you said, to give us the country that we live in today. And that's why it's so impressive you honor them in this way. And as the clock moves on, I hate to say, but I guess there will probably be less and less folks that get to attend this event and get to share in the airplanes with you and everyone else that flies them in. But it's so, I don't know, wonderful is the wrong word to use. It's just so incredible. I can see the smile on your face. Yeah. I know it's something that you enjoy and appreciate doing, but...
Well, after 2014, and I'd sort of pitched that to the guys who brought their Stearmans, that this may be the last chance we have to do it. My dad died in 2010, which was exactly 1 week before his 90th birthday.
Wow.
Which for an old Marine who at one point didn't think he was going to live to see 25 was not a bad deal. But after we did that, people in the community said, well, I hope you guys are going to do this again next year. And we said, well, probably not. We're not sure whether we'd even have enough guys. And then we got to thinking about it because people were saying, you really have to do it. So at that point we said, all right, we'll do Veterans Flight 2015, the final mission. And of course, once you get it to that stage, you got to have shirts and other stuff. Lined up a lot of airplanes. We had 10 that year, 10 Stearmans. And about 10 days before the flights, I got a call from a gentleman named Paul McLean, who had been an Army B-29 pilot. Lives here in Pensacola, or lived in Pensacola. He called me, said, I apologize for being a pain in the posterior, but I have to fly on Friday. I cannot fly Saturday. I said, well, Mr. McLean, I haven't made the schedule yet, so that shouldn't be a problem, but I know you live in Pensacola. Why couldn't you fly on Saturday if we need to accommodate some folks from out of town? And his response was, my family has too damn much planned for my 99th birthday on Saturday. So I said, okay, you're on Friday's schedule. He drove himself to the airport.
Wow.
Flew, great time. A few days after the flights, I got a handwritten thank you note from him. And a lot of those folks will do that.
Yeah, I'm sure.
And then about 2 weeks later, the receptionist buzzed me and said, there's a Paul McLean on the phone for you. So I picked it up and said, Mr. McLean, how are you, sir? And he said, I'm good. He said, I've been thinking. I said, okay, here we go. I said, well, tell me about it. He So I'd really like to do this again next year for my 100th birthday. I said, well, Mr. McLean, if you look at your shirt, you'll see it says, the final mission. I said, but there's no way I can say no. I said, we'll do something this next year. I'm not sure it'll be as big as what we did this year, but we'll do something. So, of course, immediately people start kidding me. So, wait a minute, I thought that was a final mission. I said, well, there's always one more mission. So 2016 became the final mission. More shirts, and we had more Stearmans and more veterans. And then it has since gone on from then. We became a 501c3 nonprofit corporation, got the blessing of the Internal Revenue Service that we're tax exempt, that sort of thing. And the support we have gotten from the local community, from the Santa Rosa Island Authority, their Director of Administration, Robbie Schrock, who has done a wonderful job with the air show and incidentally was one of the people who saved the homecoming show this past year when COVID and security and possibly even budget constraints made it impossible to have the Blue Angels homecoming air show at NAS Pensacola.
Absolutely. Got moved to the beach, and it was a wonderful success.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the Island Authority was largely responsible for that, and Robbie in particular. But they've just done a great job supporting veterans flight. We've gotten to the point where we can bring some of these veterans in. For example, when the two came from Illinois, a very successful businessman in Chicago put them in his private turboprop and brought them down here.
Wow, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's...
The burden of travel is not a small one, especially, yeah.
And they don't have to fool with the airlines. They don't have to go through security, though I found out recently that if you're over, I think, 70 or 72, you don't have to take your shoes off. Or maybe it was 75. I'm not sure what it was. But I got to keep my shoes on.
That's wonderful.
But we can get them here, and we can have a good time. And by the way, the museum this past year, even though there are restrictions that getting on base, getting to the museum, the folks out there worked with us wonderfully to be able to get the families of some of the veterans who came from outside the local area on base and into the museum.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's really, really great. Perfect segue into my next question, which was, you mentioned the families, and a lot of times these folks come, like you said, with the veterans. What's it like seeing them? And I know, obviously, you fly, you're Stearman as part of the event. You're the chief herder of cats. You organize the whole thing. So I think you have a perspective that maybe other people don't. What's it like seeing them, with the veteran around the airplane again? It's got to be a really cool perspective for them, something they probably haven't seen before.
I think for many of them, it's seeing their grandfather, great-grandfather, sometimes just even the father. And even though we've had a WASP fly with us, the great bulk of these folks are male.
Of course.
They see them in an entirely different light, and I think it gives them an appreciation for what their father, grandfather, great-grandfather was part of and accomplished. So it's one of the regrets I have about the whole process is there's so much activity going on that I don't get to spend as much time with some of these folks as I would like.
Of course.
And the same thing's true with the other pilots. I mean, in some ways, our mission is to get them in the air. And unfortunately, we're time constrained because the restricted airspace, or the TFR, the temporary flight restrictions for the air show, typically go into effect at about 11:30 in the morning. So we have to get the flying with the veterans done before that, because the FAA will not permit us to carry passengers in waivered airspace.
During the air show itself.
Yeah.
Because and I should mention that, you're doing the veterans flights, but then you actually perform in the air show itself as well. So dual-hatted there.
Technically, there's a group of veterans flight pilots that are technically performers in the air show.
Yes.
Now, we do a formation demonstration with the Stearmans, very similar to what you might see was done during the war. I think we fly a little bit closer than they did in their student training.
I think so, too. You guys look good. I've seen a lot of the photos of it, yes.
In many ways, and there's some little controversy in the FAA with this, because it doesn't make sense to say you can't fly passengers doing what we're doing simply because it's waivered airspace. Because we're not turning these airplanes upside down, we're not doing aerobatics, we're not putting G's on them, that sort of thing. We're just sort of having a good time showing the airplanes and the heritage of the airplanes to the people that are out there. We had it worked out in 2000, before the show was canceled by COVID. We were going to do a 6-ship Delta for the second year, but the 2000 Delta was going to have in each airplane a 100-plus-year-old pilot in the front.
Wow.
We had more than 6 100-year-old
wow.
veterans who were going to fly in 2000, and it got canceled.
2020. Yep, for the
2020.
2020.
I'm
Yep.
sorry.
Yeah, I know.
2020.
Yep.
And
man,
it was doubly unfortunate because that was the 75th anniversary of America's victory in World War II.
Yep. Yeah, very special year.
But just watching these guys talk to each other, talk to the young ensigns. Typically, there's a contingent of Sea Cadets that comes out on Saturdays. I mean, this is living history. There's a wonderful photographer from Birmingham whose name is Jeff Reese. Jeff has a huge project going on, actually internationally, where he photographs World War II veterans. And he is here for Veterans Flight, and he spends time with those veterans, taking their photographs, getting some biographical information. And of course, as the pilots, we don't get to see much of that. We see the finished product, but very often, the little bit I've been able to spend in watching some of it, watching the process is every bit as enjoyable as seeing the final product, in some ways even more so.
Of course, of course. Well, one thing I definitely want to make sure I ask is, for folks that are interested in helping, obviously, if you know someone who's a World War II veteran that would be interested in this, you guys have a great website, and I'll make sure I include that. If folks want to reach out and help, how could they do that?
Well, right now, the main help we need is identifying World War II aircraft crew to get them to fly with us.
Okay.
That's the main thing.
And the best way to reach out to you is through the website. I think there's an email address on there and a phone number.
Veteransflight@cox.net.
Okay, perfect.
Pretty easy thing.
Perfect.
Obviously, tax-deductible donations are always welcomed. We've had some great sponsors. And I shouldn't say had. We have great sponsors.
Present tense, yep, of course.
Yeah, we have great sponsors because we need to get airplanes here. We need to house the veterans when they come out. Just little things like the food.
Yeah.
We have food for the veterans, for the families, for the ensigns, the second lieutenants. Second lieutenants seem to eat more, but they work hard. There's just a lot of things going on. And one of the things that makes my job easier is, again, the Island Authority, because the Island Authority invites our pilots and the out-of-town veterans to come to the Friday night party they have for the Blue Angels at Pensacola Beach.
Oh, wow. That's awesome.
And the daughter and son-in-law of one of the local veterans, and the daughter and son-in-law are both retired Navy captains, live in Gulf Breeze. In the non-COVID years, they always have had a Thursday night reception for pilots and sponsors at their home.
Oh, wonderful. Okay.
I mean, because when I'm asking someone to bring their airplane to Pensacola, I mean, yes, the Island Authority helps pay for some of the fuel, that sort of thing. But still, it's an expense for somebody to come down here and do it. And I can't just say, bring your airplane here on Thursday afternoon. We're going to fly some media people. We're going to fly some VIPs for the Island Authority, and then go find a hamburger somewhere. No, there's got to be some activity.
Yes. And again, like you mentioned, these are World War II airplanes. There's hangar space to think about. There's weather to think about. There's a lot of logistics that you're helping handle for that weekend.
Well, absolutely. And Bill Hudgens, who owns both Pensacola Aviation Center and Innisfree Jet Center at Pensacola International, has done so much to make this happen. I mean, very frankly, veterans flight in many ways is a pain in the posterior for them. You know, we're bringing in a lot of people on Friday and Saturday that take up parking spaces, take up lobby spaces, come out on the ramp. You know, I won't say they're a security issue, but they're a security concern because there's certain rules that you have to play by at an airline airport.
Of course.
And Bill Hudgens and his people have just been absolutely wonderful. And typically, they can find space to put the airplanes in hangars.
That's great. I think that's an incredibly important point to make.
Yep.
Yeah, not every. I don't know where you would do it if you couldn't do it at Pensacola Airport. And I'm sure there's somewhere around here you could find, but it would be more of a logistical burden, and people would have to travel even more. And they make it happen. I mean, you make it happen, but they make it happen as well.
And all of the civilian performers for the beach air show stage at Pensacola International.
Yep.
Of course, the Blue Angels stage at NAS.
Yeah, but there's a lot going on.
Yeah.
It's a busy airport, yes. And
it's busy airspace, and the airline traffic and a lot of the training traffic does not stop simply because we're doing this. And the good folks at approach control and at the tower have been absolutely terrific in working with us. And some of the Stearman pilots are used to flying off grass airports where you don't have to talk to anybody. And
it's a bit of a learning curve, I'm guessing.
Yeah. And let's put it this way. When you come back and you've got maybe 4 to 6 airplanes together, it takes a little bit to get them all on the ground. And if they're cleared to land, other people have got to wait a little bit, just like sometimes we have to wait before we can take off.
Yep.
So the folks here, we get great support for them.
That's wonderful. Just as a data point, since you mentioned it, my brain was thinking of 2 T6s coming in for the break, and we fly the break, and we can be on deck maybe a minute and a half. I'm guessing for 4 or 6 Stearman, you're hanging onto the pattern. What's the good formation airspeed? What are you flying at when you're coming in for the break to land?
When we're coming in to actually do the break, ideally we'll be in a little bit of a descent to get a little bit more energy or smash or whatever you want to call it. And then you'll start the break. But typically you're coming down final at 70
miles an hour?
70 to 75 miles an hour, not knots.
Yeah, gotcha. Wow, that's really cool that everything it all works though. It's something that now
we can be a little tighter in than the T6s can.
True, but we can fall out of the sky a lot faster too.
I know Stearmans can fall out of the sky pretty fast if you need them to.
I guess that's a good point.
And I don't know the rules for the T6 whether the first aircraft has to clear the runway before the other touches down, but we can touch down and clear to the side and still be on the runway.
Hot side, cold side, yeah.
And the lead aircraft should actually land further down.
Absolutely, yep.
In other words, they're going to actually go through the intersection
yes.
before the turnoff. And then the others stagger, and the final aircraft should land fairly close to the arrival end of the runway.
Absolutely. Roy, I know you have a lot of experience, like we talked about, so many different airplanes, and I apologize, jumping back and forth. Compared to some of the other airplanes you've flown, I think we mentioned Cessnas, you have an MU-2. What's the Stearman like as an airplane in formation? Obviously we know its initial role was to be a primary trainer for those entering all the services back in World War II. But where would you what are strengths? What are weaknesses? You're an owner too, so you see what it's like to maintain the airplane and fly the airplane. What do you like about it? What do you maybe wish it was better at? Just kind of broadly speaking, I want to hear from a Stearman owner. I've talked to Phil, now I want to talk to you about it.
Well, with Stearman, you have to recognize its 1930s technology. I kid about the fact that, and this is an aviation term, there's probably never been a finer airplane design to demonstrate the concept of adverse aileron yaw than a Stearman. When I get someone in the Stearman, a pilot, for their first time, at some point, I'll say, put your feet on the floor. Now, I want you to take the stick, and I don't care whether you go to the right or go to the left, but make a turn to the left, make a turn to the right, but keep your feet flat on the floor. And roll in, not slowly, but not rapidly either, just positively. And they'll push the stick typically to the left, move the stick to the left, and watch the nose. The nose will go to the right.
At adverse yaw? Yeah.
Adverse yaw.
Yep, absolutely.
And it's because back then the airplanes were not designed with differential ailerons. I don't know about your RV, but Cessna 172, if you roll into a turn to the left, the downward traveling aileron will not go down as far as the upward traveling aileron will go up.
Okay.
So you will not have as much drag, since you potentially have more drag if they were equal on the outside because of the angle of attack of the wing. Well, the guys that developed the Stearman or designed the Stearman, they weren't concerned with that. And as a result, you have to use the rudder. But most importantly, you learn to use the rudder, or the student aviators in the early 1940s learned to use the rudder.
Okay.
The Stearman is a very easy airplane to fly. However, it can be a challenging airplane to fly well. The takeoff and landing characteristics of it, especially the landing characteristics, require much more attention and precision than landing a tricycle gear airplane.
Is it a 2-point technique that you use, or do you go for a full 3-point when you touch down? Again, broad questions here I'm asking, but...
And the answer to that is it depends.
My favorite answer. Okay.
My personal feeling is that if you're going into Ferguson, for example, a grass strip, number one, your speed is a little bit slower, and you 3-point the airplane.
Okay.
For the full stall land.
Yep.
And largely because grass is forgiving. On the hard surfaces, again, it will vary a little bit depending upon the conditions, but you'll be faster than you would in a full stall or 3-point landing. And in many ways, it's like landing a seaplane on glassy water. You set up a rate of descent, and you don't try to flare the airplane. You just let it settle until the main gear touches. When the main gear touches, you relax stick pressure. Don't push it dramatically. Just relax it a little bit. The tail will come up, and beware of gyroscopic precession at that point, and reduce the power. And continue to, quote, fly the airplane as it rolls out. If you've got a strong crosswind, you might actually be up on one wheel.
Really?
Yeah. Wow. For a while.
Okay. Holding that input in as you bleed energy. Huh. That's incredible.
In many ways, with a Stearman, it is easier to be too fast than to be too slow.
Makes sense. What is that engine response like if you are too slow and you try to cob in a bunch of power? Is it going to fix it, or are you behind the power curve? You're not going to be able to catch up if you put a big power input in.
Generally, if you do and it's a smooth application, not an abrupt.
Yeah.
But a smooth application, especially if you recognize the problem early enough. There's no difficulty in salvaging. You may end up going around.
Sure. But you're going to stay flying, and you're going to be able to bring the airplane around again. Yeah, makes sense. Well, again, I want to talk about all the different airplanes, and I know you mentioned the engine failure at Pompano Beach. Any other good, I don't want to say emergencies, but any other good flying stories, things that have maybe not gone your way? Any other good story? I know obviously you're a skydiver as well. I think we talked about a story about that as well over the water, but...
Well, we'll stick with airplanes today.
Okay, that sounds fine. I have one skydiving question, but I'll ask you that after the story, if that's okay.
One of the things you learn as you get older is that you never really have to be anywhere. And that's true whether you're in a Stearman, which is not an all-weather airplane, or you're in an MU-2, which is pretty close to an all-weather airplane. There's an old saying in aviation that when somebody kills themselves in a weather accident, generally the funeral is on a blue sky day. And the main thing is you don't want to have your friends saying, I can't believe he was that stupid. So you learn to make certain choices about when you do things, when you don't. Now, some things you can't control. A number of years ago, I had a wonderful airplane. It was a Beech Baron, twin engine, and it was a pressurized Baron. And my wife and I were coming back from Salt Lake City. We took off from Salt Lake City, climbed up to 23,000 feet, bright sunshine with a huge tailwind. And we're headed back towards Pensacola. And we're just about over Aspen, Colorado. And you look down, you can say, hey, glad we're not down there because of the weather. I mean, the weather's good up here, and I'm listening to weather on the frequency, and Denver is not good at all, and we're not planning on stopping in Denver. We're going on to the Oklahoma City area. My wife's in the back reading. Outside air temperature is about minus 50 to 55 degrees. And that's both Fahrenheit and centigrade are about the same right there, so it's just real cold.
Real cold.
But we're cruising along. Everything's looking good. Engines are running well. Of course, they're turbocharged to get you up that high. And I noticed a slight tick, slight movement in the manifold pressure of the left engine. Not much. I mean, just barely. But I've had the airplane for a while, knew the airplane, and that's strange. And I told the controller, I said, I'm not sure we've got any problem or not, but may need to change the plan here in a minute. And about the time I finish the conversation, the manifold pressure just starts going down. Get the boost pump on, everything else, not doing anything. Oil pressure's good, oil temperature's good, power's going away. And finally gets down to the point where this is obviously not going to get solved, so I feather the engine. So at this point, we are single engine, well above the rocks, clear sky, still going very fast towards Denver, where the weather is not good, and it turned out actually they closed the airport in Denver. We didn't find that out till later. Aspen I had been into before. It is a challenging airport under the best of circumstances, and weather can change there very rapidly. And of course, this is in the winter. And I'm talking to the controller. I said, what do we got that's VFR around here? And he said, well, we have Rifle, Colorado, which was back in the end of the wind. I think it was about 40 miles away, clear. And they have an ILS if you need it. I said, let's go to Rifle. So we turn around, go to Rifle. And of course, at this stage, you realize you have limited capabilities, because even if the airplane is functioning properly on one engine, when you lose one of two engines, you have probably lost 80 to maybe even 90% of your twin engine capability, because airplanes climb because of excess power, and you've lost your excess power. You don't have much of it left. On the other hand, had a very stable airplane. We burned fuel out of it coming from Salt Lake City, and there were just two of us in it. So it was not anywhere near the maximum gross weight. But we're also at fairly high altitude out there in that western side of Colorado. So then you get to Rifle, everything's looking good. We land, and if you've used Barron's, you realize that one of their limitations is if you let it slow down on the ground in one engine, you're going to need a tow. You've got to keep it moving. If you keep it moving, you're fine. And we kept it moving, get to the ramp, shut it down. So everybody's glad to be in Rifle, Colorado in one piece, and we haven't bent anything. Get out, look at the engine. No holes in the cowling, no oil coming out of it. Everything looks pretty good. Open it up, look, nothing obviously wrong. Let's drain some fuel. Drain some fuel, everything looks good. And of course, in the meantime, there have been a couple of phone calls, and center wants to know you're okay. Yeah, we're okay, and okay, that sort of thing. Yeah, go use the bathroom, head, whatever. Forget whether they got anything to eat or not, but I'm paying more attention to the airplane trying to figure this out.
Of course, yeah.
And, you have a couple of people there at the airport, and they're looking at it, don't say that. Let's see if it'll start. It does. And it runs. And we let it run for a while. You do the mag checks, all the normal stuff. Everything looks normal. Could not find anything wrong. And you say, did I inadvertently turn off the fuel or something like that? No. P. Barron's either on, off, or cross feed. And it was in the same position as it was when we left Salt Lake City, hour and a half or so before that. Did not touch it. It's not one of those things that you could nudge with your knee or anything like that. Everything's good. Didn't turn the mags off. No. You'd have known that in a heartbeat. Bottom line is we ended up flying the airplane back to Pensacola. I think when it's 17 coming back, where it was considerably warmer. And let's put it this way. I kept checking the gauges even more frequently. I think my wife was staring at them too from the back seat since she's a pilot. But we get back to Pensacola, and over the next few days started trying to figure out what happened, why it happened. And I talked to the people at Continental, and ultimately ended up talking to the folks at PPG. And I always thought that's Pittsburgh Plate Glass. Well, they have a division that makes Prist, which is, I'd always thought of as a jet fuel additive. Well, it turns out that they also make an additive for avgas. Same composition, just a different flow rate as it's added. Of course, in today's world, most jet fuel is already pre-mixed with pressed. And talking with their folks and talking with the FAA, the analysis of the problem was that the fuel got so cold that water that is in suspension, and all fuel has some water in it. You could drain every bit of fuel out of the airplane, it would never show up. But it's in there, gets super cooled, and when it hits a bend in the fuel system or a screen, it freezes. And ultimately, we got enough ice built up from that it starved the fuel to that one engine. Why didn't it do it on the other side? Don't know. It may have been in the process of happening, but just hadn't happened yet. If it had happened to both engines, it would have been dumb lawyer crashes in mountain for no apparent reason.
Yeah.
Because it never would have found it.
A near miss.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. That's incredible. That's truly incredible. And you're here today to talk about it.
Here today to talk about it. If we'd been in a single engine airplane, either nothing would have happened or we would have crashed.
Yeah.
One of the two.
And I assume you were over some pretty unforgiving terrain, like you mentioned, some pretty terrible weather all around you.
Yeah. I mean, it would have been challenging to get somewhere based on where it happened in a single, even a single with very good glide characteristics. But it did.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it did.
Ballpark, how many hours do you have? Do you remember? Just big round number.
6,900 and change.
That's a lot.
Well, you got to remember, I'm an old guy. I've been doing this for a while.
True, very true, very true. In that 6,900 hours and change, what would you say if you had to distill it down to one thing? You don't have. I'm kind of putting you on the spot here, but broadly speaking, I think one of the coolest things when you have that amount of flight time. I have 1,900 hours, which is nothing, but there are certain lessons that it just got to come back repeatedly. Certain things that, I definitely share with my students. I share with other people I fly with. Is there anything maybe in that 6,900 hours that maybe jumps out at you that you like to share with others and try to, that way they don't have to learn the lesson themselves?
Well, unfortunately, I think people, for the most part, do have to learn lessons for themselves. From the standpoint of judgment or planning, you don't have to be somewhere. And just a quick analysis of one of those situations. Recently, we've been making fairly regular trips to Houston. And we were out there on a Friday. It was in December. And we wanted to get back to Pensacola. It's been a long day. And it was one of those days where you're watching the temperature dew point spread very closely. And it was obvious to me that when we got back to Pensacola, it would be marginal whether we would be able to get in or not. And so you analyze it, and you say, what will happen if we can't get in there? Well, we're going to go to Montgomery, or we're going to go maybe back to somewhere in Louisiana, though we'll probably have to be well off the coast because Louisiana's on the coast going to be down, and of course you're coming the coast. But the odds are, if we do go tonight, we're going to end up going somewhere else and not spending the night at home. We'd come out the day before and spent the night in Houston. Wouldn't it make a lot more sense just to spend another night in Houston and then tomorrow sleep in a little bit on Saturday, go have breakfast at the place where we had breakfast this morning? It was very good. And then we'll come back after checking the weather. So we end up coming back the next day, getting here about 11 o'clock, and it's sunshine. But it would have been very marginal the night before. And it just didn't make sense.
Yeah.
Now, as far as actually flying airplanes, one of the things that I think most people need is training and experience that allows them to, the term I use is unload the airplane close to the ground. A lot of general aviation pilots, in my opinion, are not good at flying the airplane close to the ground.
And when you talk about close to the ground, you mean in that landing flare or when you're taking off, that last couple feet?
Flare or the approach.
Okay.
That sort of thing.
They're just making an input and waiting for something to happen. They're not controlling their destiny.
They're not really feeling or understanding what the airplane is going to do.
Okay.
Now, that's more important in the lighter airplanes like Stearmans or Cessna 150s or 172s, 182s. When you're flying something like a King Air or an MU-2, the heavier equipment, or just a piston twin, you want to fly something much more akin to the airline's stabilized approach, where, at least in instrument conditions, 1,000 feet above the airport, you're on speed, your attitude is proper, the rate of descent's proper, you're on the glide path, and modern GPS with the LPV approaches have made our lives much safer. But we still manage to kill a bunch of people every year. And it shouldn't happen to the bulk of them.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think it's that focus on fundamentals, that fundamental ability to fly the airplane. I had a flight recently with a friend who I won't name, but we got airborne, and pretty shortly after becoming airborne, he was clicking on the automation, an autopilot. I said, "Man, what are you doing? Let's fly the air. There's a wonderful airplane that you have here. Let's fly let's get a feel for it." And it was my first time in that airplane,
Yep.
So that's why I was disappointed. I'm sure you've heard the term "children of the magenta."
Yep.
People that are so and it's easy, right? It's bright colors, and it's I don't know. It all seems like it's going on. Look outside. Be part of the environment around you.
And it's really neat stuff. It is.
Yeah.
But it's not flying.
Yeah.
It's systems managing.
Yes.
And there's nothing wrong with that.
Exactly. Yep. There's a time and a place for either.
Though,
or both, I should say.
It's interesting you brought this up, because in the MU-2 community, and the MU-2 is a general aviation airplane that is very demanding of type-specific training. As a matter of fact, it is mandated by the FAA, Federal Aviation Regulations, that you receive certain training and have certain experience before you can act as pilot in command of that airplane. But there's some folks who have come into the MU-2 community that some of us are concerned. I say, if the autopilot's not working, are these people going to survive? Now, fortunately, most of them quickly want to learn more. And when you go to a training provider like SimCom, which is the main MU-2 training center as far as simulators are concerned, you get a pretty good workout down there, and you also learn a lot about the system. But it's also an airplane that does not give you the same, and I call it kinesthetic feedback, that you get with a typical general aviation airplane. So you fly it a little bit differently. You could be a great Stearman pilot and a terrible MU-2 pilot, or a great MU-2 pilot and a terrible Stearman pilot. They're very different animals.
Very different. And I should have mentioned that those are the two animals that you have in the stable, right? You have the Stearman, and you have an MU-2, which is a high-wing twin turboprop.
Yep.
Mitsubishi, correct?
Correct.
Mitsubishi.
Same guys who brought us the Zero during World War II.
I hadn't thought of it that way. Yes, yeah. Absolutely. Worlds apart in performance, worlds apart in knowledge necessary.
Well, in some ways that's good, though, because there's no confusion between the two.
Sure. That's a great point. Wow. And Roy, I'm going to have to rely on you. Are there any other airplanes I missed along your 6,900 hours that we should talk about?
Now, most airplanes are relatively similar. Some may be high wing, some may be low wing, but the performances are similar. The handling is relatively similar.
Sure. I think the common thread is you can do really cool things. You can go really cool places. You can meet really cool people and interesting people, because aviation is so broad. It's not just a Cessna or a Stearman,
right,
or an airliner. I jokingly say I don't even consider airliners aviation. That's a whole other conversation. But when you're jumping in the back of it, it's just jumping in a metal tube. but there's so much more out there. There's so many more wonderful ways that people can. I mean, you talked about flying out to, you said Utah, right? Like it's, you know, it's nothing. I'm so fortunate to get to use our airplane to go home to Tennessee or visit family and friends in other parts of the country. It opens up the world. People say it's a time machine. I don't know if you ever heard about an airplane as a time machine. And I always used to think that was a really, you know, kind of a cute joke. And then I realized, oh no, I fast forwarded in time. I would have spent 8 hours in a car. I spent 2 hours in the airplane. And I had a great time in the airplane. I loved it. I loved flying and seeing the weather and, you know.
Well, a number of years ago.
It's a different way to think about the world.
Yeah, a number of years ago, I was involved in a case where our side had witnesses that were in Atlanta and also in Charlotte. And the lawyer on the opposing side wanted to take their deposition, which obviously he has the right to do. He put them down in front of a court reporter, put them under oath, and ask them questions. And I said, no problem. And he said, well, it's going to take us 3 days to do this. And I said, wait a minute, I've had other cases with you. I know you don't waste time here. You concentrate on the real issues, and you know, you need a couple hours with each one of them. You get it done. He said, yeah. I said, tell you what, let me do a little check-in here. So I called the witness in Atlanta and said, would you mind coming to DeKalb Peachtree Airport rather than going downtown to one of the court reporters' offices? He said, of course. I live fairly close to DeKalb Peachtree. I'd much rather do that than go downtown. So I talked to the folks at Epps Air Service and at Peachtree DeKalb and made arrangements. Talked to folks in Charlotte, and the office of the person who's going to be deposed in Charlotte was very close to the airport. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to get an airplane. We're going to take the court reporter with us. We're going to fly up to Atlanta. Witness is going to meet us at Epps. We'll do that, then we'll fly up to Charlotte. We'll do that, and then we'll come home. So we get up there. Epps had a conference room set up for us. They actually had pastries and coffee in there for us. Go in, do that deposition, pay the bill, get an airplane, fly up to Charlotte. FBO loans us a crew car. We go over to the office, take the deposition, come back, and we're home in time for dinner. It was a late dinner, but home in time for dinner.
In one day, not 3.
One night. You could not have done it on the airline.
Not a chance. No. Yeah.
I've been in depositions. We're talking to an expert medical witness at Duke a number of years ago. It was a medical malpractice case, and we had lots of lawyers. You always have lots of lawyers in those cases. And suddenly there's one guy who says, would you mind if I ask some questions out of order because I'm going to have to leave for the airport pretty soon to get my flight back to Tallahassee or wherever it was. I said, sure, go ahead, which he did. But my flight didn't leave till I left.
Because you were in the left seat. You were the pilot. Yeah.
I mean, so it not only saves you time, it gives you flexibility that others don't have.
Yep.
And the other thing is, I probably shouldn't confess to this, but it gives you a feeling of accomplishment to take some of these trips. I mean, we've taken the MU-2 to Alaska. We took the P. Barron to Alaska. We've been up in the east part of Canada, that sort of thing. And you get to go places that most people don't get to go. I mean, we went to Alaska in the MU-2 and flew from Anchorage to Minchumina. Minchumina is a 4,000-foot-long gravel airstrip on the west side of Denali National Park, and was constructed and used during World War II to ferry airplanes to Russia.
Wow, that's incredible. Grass and gravel.
Gravel airstrip, yeah.
Oh my gosh.
And we spent 3 days there at Denali West Lodge.
Yep.
And then after that, went from there to Nome. And Nome, with an outfitter we'd been with before, He picks us up at the airport. We go up to a little town called Council, which is on the Nyukluk River, and you spend a couple of days up there fishing in the Nyukluk River. And I mean, it's
another world.
Oh, it definitely is. And it's a wonderful place.
Yeah.
And you see terrain that you've never seen before.
Wow. I know this isn't internationally, but you mentioned Canada. What was it like flying general aviation outside of the United States? Was it a huge burden, or was it pretty intuitive?
Actually, Canada, at least when we were doing it, is very easy.
Okay.
The only problem that we ever had going into Canada was one guy seemed a little skeptical that we didn't have firearms.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Which we didn't. We're in a twin-engine airplane.
Okay.
Now, if we were in a single going to Alaska, you have to, by law in Alaska, have survival equipment, including a firearm.
Including a firearm. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, it would obviously be something other than a pistol.
Yeah.
If you want to actually eat something.
Exactly.
And we used to go to the Bahamas quite a bit.
Okay. Where in the Bahamas specifically?
Most of the time we would go to Treasure Key on Great Abaco.
That's what I've heard. I have some friends that have Bonanzas and Barons, and that's where they go to. Okay. I've seen the photos. It looks incredible. Very beautiful.
It's a wonderful place where you've got some rocks surrounded by beautiful water. You go a little bit further south, you get some little bit different topography when you get down around Long Island, south of Eleuthera, that area.
Okay. A couple of long legs out over water where it's just you, the raft, the little vest that you have on, and that's about it. Because if you lose the motor, you're going to go swimming.
It can be.
Yeah.
And in the early days, we went down there a lot in singles, but of course in recent years, go down. Now, one of the good things in very recent years is the airport at Treasure Key, which is an airport of entry, so you have customs to clear inboard and outboard there, ended up getting fuel. When we initially started going down there, they didn't have fuel, so we'd have enough on board to go to Treasure Key, come back to Fort Pierce, and then fuel there, clear customs, and come back. But once they got fuel down there, we could get an overflight permit from customs to come to Pensacola, because we have customs here because of the port.
Yes.
Though now the airport has gotten so busy, they're constructing, almost finished, a customs facility there.
Yes,
which
absolutely.
is great.
On the general aviation side, which is very impressive.
Yeah.
Wow, so you could make it all the way back.
Yeah.
Wow, that's really cool.
Yeah, here to Treasure Key in the MU-2 was an easy trip.
That's really, really cool. I've never thought of it that way because I've not had an airplane I could fly that fast and to do it. Wow, that's awesome. Roy, what haven't I asked you? I kind of like always want you to finish these up. I've got something to say at the end, but what have I not asked you about? I know you've had an incredible career in aviation. How about this? What's next? I know 2022. You already mentioned the dates for the Beach Airshow for the next Veterans Flight. I know that's next. Anything special? It's the last.
Well, we learned a number of years ago. We learned don't ever say this is the last one.
Exactly.
And very frankly, we've already started the transition into the career of
wonderful
aviators.
Yeah.
And the fact that we're going to hit a time when we don't have any more of the World War II guys. I mean, death is a natural part of life. My father used to always remind me.
Of course.
And we're going to get there where we don't have any more World War II guys. But that doesn't mean we should forget the World War II guys and what they did to make it possible for us to enjoy the lives we have. And people need to see the airplanes. And fortunately, the airplanes can be kept going. As a matter of fact, most of the Stearmans, and one of the common comments we get from the veterans that fly with us is, my God, I've never seen one this clean. They're in better condition than when they came out of the factory.
Wow. And that's because they're so well appreciated, so well looked after by you, the owners. And
well, we have some guys like Vic Syracuse, who's a big name in the RV community, and he's in the aviation business. I mean, he polishes the heat shrouds on his engine. I mean, it's all
perfection.
It puts all of us to shame. He does such a good job with it.
Yes.
And he's a great pilot in addition to being a great mechanic and craftsman. But we want people to see these airplanes. We want them to appreciate it. And we also want them to appreciate how far aviation has come in what's really a relatively short period of time.
Absolutely.
So we're going to continue it.
That's wonderful.
There are a lot of lessons there, and I don't know how many more years I'm going to be able to do it. Insurance companies are already looking at me kind of sideways. Wait a minute. So far it's been fine. I've been able to pass the flight physical every year, so that's not has not been a problem. But you realize that the step up onto the wing of the Stearman is getting higher, and mine does not have the added step that some of the guys have been smart enough to add.
Okay.
But it's also given me a little incentive to lose some weight so I can get up there a little bit easier. But hopefully judgment will counter any loss of physical skills, because it ideally will help you avoid being in a position where the physical skills really are necessary.
Absolutely. Yep.
You got a choice between great physical skills or good judgment. To stay safe in an airplane, take good judgment every time.
Yes, sir. I asked you, what's next for you, and you mentioned obviously 2022 and the next veterans flight, and like you mentioned, it'll continue to go on. One thing I wanted to say is thank you, and I think a lot of people have said thank you, but I want to say thank you as well. It would not have been hard when that golf cart came over at PAC that day. You were busy, you had somewhere to go. It would not have been hard to say, hey man, I got to run, and never stayed in touch and never followed up, and this wouldn't have started. Veterans flight wouldn't have started.
Actually, it would have been hard not to do that.
Why do you say that?
Because as the son of a Marine Corps colonel, I knew better.
Fair enough. For another person, maybe it would not have been hard to say, I've got somewhere to go, I've got something to do with my day, but you chose not to. You chose to do what you've done, and I just want to say thank you, like truly thank you so very much, because I know you've brought a lot of joy to a lot of veterans and their families, and like you said, you get to. I talk about the kiddos, the new students that we have. It's funny because I remember, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, I was them, and I realized how much they don't see. And so it's so wonderful they get to come out to the airport and see their, the people that stood in those boots many years before. So.
Well, I appreciate you saying that, and obviously I say you're welcome. Everyone's welcome. But this is not Roy doing this. Roy is just one of many people that makes this happen.
Absolutely.
I mean, my wife comes out and she is the ground ops chief. Our daughter is the flight line chief. Former deputy sheriff who's retired Navy is the flight line XO. We've got a mix of pilots that come in with their airplanes, probably close to 50-50 military, some that weren't military, but all of them with a strong sense of patriotism, love of this country, an appreciation of the older airplanes, and the fact that we owe the World War II veterans a debt that we can never repay.
Can't say it any better than that. Thank you so very much.
Well, it's my pleasure.
Thanks, Ray.